So, this is the blog we put out last week. This blog is covering conflict, combat, and griefing in BitCraft. Um, and why did we write this blog? After we announced the game on Steam, we got a lot of new eyeballs in the game, and a lot of people hearing about BitCraft for either the first time or the first time in a long time. And there was a lot of questions around the game around many topics, but the monetization was one which we hopefully addressed in the previous blog and stream that we did. If you haven't seen that, I definitely recommend going and watching that, the YouTube VOD from that. And the second kind of biggest topic, which there was a few interrelated ones, was basically combat, conflict, and griefing. And so lots of questions around these three topics that we wanted to address. And due to their kind of interdependencies, we decided to write a blog covering those three things, which we're going to look at together today.
And one thing I'll throw out there is we see a lot people assume there is no combat in Bitcraft, and that is not true. It's really, I mean, it has been true at times, but it's never intentionally been true. We've always intended to have combat in the game. Just for some reason, people kind of equate that with PvP sometimes. So we'll talk about some of that today, but let's go through it.
Cool. Yeah, I think we're going to go section by section. We're not going to I don't think the plan is to read each section out loud, but basically we can go section by section and kind of talk a little bit about it and then answer questions on that section. And we'll try to go through all the topics in it before we run out of time today. So, the role of combat in Bitcraft. I guess we can maybe start with the beginning here. Do you want to talk a little bit, Tyler, about the similar to other or similar and contrasting with other MMOs? What is the role of combat in Bitcraft? Do you want to give a little summary
Sure,
of
I'll
this?
give a brief summary. We had another blog post about some of this stuff, progression related, but I'll give a brief summary. So in Bitcraft, the role of combat is to make adventures into the wilderness exciting. It's to make the wild wild and your home cozy. And it's also supposed to be a fun experience you can do with your friends. And the problem that we see in other MMOs that have combat as a core progression mechanic, so that is to say you fight monsters just all the time and you just keep fighting monsters and you get better, you get more powerful, is that if you and your friend did not start at the same time, then you can't really play with your friend because you have to be somewhat at the same level. And the way that a lot of MMOs get around this is either they squash everybody's experience every season, or they do like sort of like, oh, well, we're going to give you a boost if you join this instance with your friend so that you can all play together. And that kind of defeats the whole point of the progression in the first place. Because, like, what's the point of the progression if you can just skip the progression anyway? And so we wanted to do something a little bit different and have combat be a recreational thing, but not necessarily a core progression mechanic in the game.
Yeah.
That's the
I,
context there.
I think just to build a little bit off that is there's also the fact that I think most other traditional MMOs, or we can call it, or like what you would think of if you think of like classic theme park MMOs, the entire gameplay is centered around the combat as like the core progression. Whereas in Bitcraft, the nature of the sandbox world and building and crafting and all these other things, these take more of a front seat. And so independent of just how the progression works, it's also just where other games it is, I would say, more of like the primary focus of the entire game. In Bitcraft, there's some other things that are going on that take more of a front seat. And so that's not to say that combat is like we're intending for combat to be this like very niche side thing. But it also is not like front and center the main point of the game.
Not at all. And in fact, the idea is that you should be able to specialize in Bitcraft, but everybody can do combat. And that's part of the thing is like, hey, if my friend joins and be like, hey, I know that you're a fisher, but here's all my old gear. Let's go adventuring. That's the idea. That's the point of this. So we'll see.
Cool. We can touch briefly on, I guess this is a summary of what some of the things that we've been working on. So I can quickly go through these and then maybe we
Let's go
can do
through.
questions on if there's any questions off the bat. Which is basically what have we been working on since Alpha 3, which was last fall, until the end of basically 2024, for those who are aware of that. Basically, what have we spent the last quarter working on? Well, we've added an updated stat system that's made getting gear and progressing through the tiers of combat gear way more useful and interesting. We've changed what happens when you get KO'd, which is basically in the past you used to drop your cargo, get stunned basically and teleport home. Now we've changed it. So basically, there were some issues with this where either it was really frustrating to get sent home, dying to it in like kind of a annoying thing, and it was also not really that punishable if you were already at home because you could be in your base defending against monsters and you would just die again and again and again and keep respawning and there was no penalty. So we wanted to balance those two things. And so the summary of how we've changed this is just you can optionally get up or teleport home if you've been KO'd. And every time you get KO'd, there's some short term and medium term debuffs and kind of penalties associated with that, which we can get into more later, that hopefully make it so just repeatedly running back again and again to get KO'd again and again, or even getting up again and again, is not going to be something you necessarily want to do. It's going to be punishing. Um, Combat outcomes are less deterministic now. So before, you always did the same damage, you always took the same damage. It was very calculatable. Now there's a certain element of randomness and like range in every attack and hit received. So that should make things more exciting. Um, we previously allowed you to cast buffs on yourself when you did combat actions, but now we also allow you to debuff enemies. So being able to like apply a slow or a stun to an enemy is now possible, which is going to open up a lot of doors for what we can do with the combat. We're working to improve the responsiveness, and we've kind of revamped the targeting UI as a part of this, and the how the action bar works and how kind of your abilities trigger in terms of timing. And in the future, we're planning to add some other things that are going to allow us to do more intricate and interesting encounters. The main two things being uh, basically the ability for enemies to do area attacks or ground attacks. So basically, instead of, if you have this big boss or mini boss enemy, instead of just attacking the player in front of it with the highest threat, it could also do like a big stomp and like stun everyone or damage everyone. And so positioning will matter. Whereas right now in combat, positioning doesn't matter a whole lot. Um, and then the last thing is just adding some more interesting stuff with like enemy phases or threat mechanics. So it's not just, one person has the most threat and they just tank. I think being able to have interesting things where like the enemies will change targets for like if there's like a weak player that they could finish off, things like that.
And then a related question, sort of, is there range or magic according to ASVP
Yeah.
or ongoing?
Yeah, I can give a quick answer on that. So right now, the in the IP like world of BitCraft in the lore, there isn't what you would consider like high fantasy magic from other maybe kind of more high fantasy games. So there's no magic right now. In the past, we were playtesting with just melee combat. Part of this was due to like enemy pathing and other kind of trying to limit the exploits there, but we're in the process of testing and adding ranged combat as well. So you hopefully will be able to play with ranged combat in the very near future.
I guess what I'll say is just PVE combat is improving that is a high priority for us now and in the near future as well, just because we can make it more fun. New weapon types,
There are new weapon types coming in beta, which is the Steam Early Access release.
healing.
We did have some healing items, so not as like a dedicated like weapon spec, but I do think some version of like a support weapon type could be cool. It's not something we have in the works this moment, but it's something we've talked about with the design team and the art team. So stay tuned. I think ultimately we went from a version of the game that had basically no PvE combat to now we have an emphasis on building this up, and so we're considering basically any idea, and we're trying to test and just carefully think about what makes sense to go into Bitcraft and what we're building towards. But we're definitely open to experimenting a lot right now.
Can you use enemies to grief other players? Not if we do our jobs right, but like possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was part of what we were trying to balance and test in Alpha 3. I think we definitely figured out some things with that. We introduced, I believe, either in Alpha 3 or at the end of Alpha 3, I don't remember exactly the timing, some systems around having the enemies, basically, if you like aggro them too far from their origin location, they'll like basically reset. And also, we prevented you from like cheesing them. So if you stand on like some really tall pillar and you just attack them and they can't reach you, then eventually they'll start evading. Will the variety of enemies be increased on the Steam release compared to Alpha 3? There's definitely new enemies coming. I think
What you
we
mean? You don't want to have just one enemy? Is that what you're saying?
Hey, there was two. But yeah, no, um
That's
the
true.
enemy, like the expansion into the PvE content was something that we were doing just basically for Alpha 3. The results of that kind of playtest gave us some useful information that we are now using to kind of add more to the game going forward. And basically, the short version of that is we are expanding the PvE stuff. So we're adding
Yeah,
more weapon types, more enemies, more mechanics, more polish. All this stuff is a priority.
it was never meant to be literally, it was a little samey. That was just because of time.
Cool. So looking a little bit at the empire scale conflict. So this is looking at, we just talked about combat, but I think a big part of Bitcraft, people ask like, is Bitcraft PvP or is there combat? But I think a lot of times what people are actually asking about is like, what's the level of conflict? And so I think without having literal character versus character fighting in, swords and shields combat, you can still have player versus player competition and conflict. And so I think it's worth talking about at the empire scale. What does that actually mean? Basically, the whole empire scale is about PvP conflict between the empires and to some extent cooperation, where the political intrigue kind of warrants it. Um, I think the one thing that we kind of touched on in this blog is that the current version of Empire Conflict, while it's technically PvP, it is very focused on like economic warfare and logistical like strategy. Part of what we want to improve with the empire conflict in the future is make it feel more like two empires are going to war. Like when you think about all the kind of real world connotations of that, we want to have the logistics feel more interesting than just delivering hexite capsules. We want to have the sieges feel more like sieges and battles. And so I think we're working on a new trailer that's teasing kind of a little bit of more of like what our ultimate vision for empires might look like. And we're showcasing in that some interesting stuff that is not coming right away to the game, but is kind of the direction we're trying to head conceptually, which is like making sieges either having like multiple cannons, having the watchtowers or the settlements be kind of more integrated together, having the logistics be more important for like cutting off a settlement so that they can't be resupplied, or cutting off a watchtower so it can't be resupplied, having the battlegrounds around a siege feel more like a battleground and not just like you and the enemy empire are sitting like 10 feet apart just like shoveling supplies into your cannon and your watchtower and just watching the tug of war meter go back and forth. We really want it to feel more like it's dangerous to be out on the battlefield and there's like some stakes there. And due to the nature that empire conflict is basically the stakes are at the empire scale, we think there's room to add basically some character scale conflict and settlement scale conflict as long as the stakes are not at the character scale in the empires, or sorry, the settlement scale. So making sure that like settlements and characters can get more involved in empire warfare without like risking their own stuff at their scales. It's really just the empire outcome is on the line.
What would be happening when the empire's world would be conquered by one empire? Is it even possible? Basically, is it possible for one empire
Yeah.
to take over?
So of course it's possible, but I would say it's kind of like an asymptote where basically for a given empire to control the whole world, it becomes like increasingly hard. We've intentionally put systems into the game that make it so that having essentially like a underdog, like new empire challenging the incumbent, the larger incumbent, has the advantage. And so what that means is you're kind of going to always have this revolving wheel of like, it's always going to be very easy to just like put a thorn in the side of the giant incumbent empire. Some of the ways that we do that is basically like the larger your empire, it scales non-linear in terms of the cost of maintaining it, and the ability for the incumbent empire, the larger they are, they still have to produce their hexite capsules in their capital, and so their requirement to do logistics, like if a new empire gets started far from the capital of the incumbent empire, they have this very short logistics requirement, whereas
Right.
the incumbent empire has to do logistics all the way across the world to fight on their like distant borders. And that combined with the kind of nonlinear maintenance cost is going to make maintaining a massive empire technically it's possible, but it's like implausible. It's more likely that we're going to see kind of several large incumbent empires and a constant kind of popping up of new, um, you know, emergent empires declaring independence or deciding to try and like, carve out a small territory that they can hold on to.
So yes, and that's related to, is there a contingency if a popular person, streamer, empire takes over most of the map? The answer is it's balanced, so that is possible, but not likely. I mean, if they're that dedicated, maybe they deserve it. I
Yeah.
guess the
I think they would need like a massive amount of momentum to keep that up long term. Is basically you would need like a constantly kind of uh
diligent.
you the bigger you get, the more you need more people, more resources maintaining that.
Let's see. Unaffiliated settlements rising up and swaying an empire battle result without being part of either. That's kind of an interesting idea. So it's not a question, but basically just like, hey, can I throw a wrench into other people's other people's situations? There's another question. Can we meaningfully contribute to an empire without paying money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, by design, I would say most of what you do in an empire is not contributing money. That the contributing money is a very small point, and only a tiny subset of players need to do that. Basically, for an empire to work, it needs a variety of things. One of those is supplies. One of those is hexite shards. One of those is kind of managing the social network of the empire. So, like, who are all the kind of the nobles and the people in charge of maintaining the empire, and who are all the people delivering supplies? Then there's the actual logistics of like operating that. And then there is the strategy behind who do you promote, which empires do you attack, which sieges do you defend or kind of give up on. All of these things can be done by anyone in the empire, and anyone can be elevated to like a role that is able to contribute to these. Only donating shards requires you to put up money. And so you could totally have an empire where the emperor is paying for the upkeep and the shard requirement of the whole empire. Say you have someone who just wants to, they really want to have an empire. There could be hundreds of players that are all helping them run that empire, and none of those players have paid anything. The emperor has paid for all of it. You could also have another empire where you have, say you have like a streamer who's an emperor. You could have hundreds or thousands of players in that empire, and a few select people are donating, similar to, how can you watch someone stream for free? Well, it's because some people are donating, and that pays the streamer to do the thing. Same thing with an empire. You could have some people donating, and that funds the shards needed for the empire to do stuff, and everyone else can be contributing in other ways. So we've
Which
intentionally,
are necessary ways.
yeah, it's
They're
if
not.
you just have the shards and you don't have people doing all the other stuff, you don't have an empire. You just have a pile of shards and one person calling themselves an emperor of nothing, basically. All the other stuff is essential.
I suppose relevant questions is how big is the world? Let's just say it's extremely large.
It's much bigger than before. I mean, basically, in
It
the
was pretty
previous
big.
alphas, we were doing a single shard, a single server shard, and we were trying to test basically the capacity and kind of the performance of that while we are also testing like gameplay in a small sandbox. What we are doing for the Steam early access release is we're not scaling infinitely necessarily because we want to just like set our sights reasonably, but we are massively scaling that up to a multi-server sharding system. So there will be basically
Cl-
order of
clarification.
magnitude at least more
Yeah,
players.
clarification on that though. It's all one world. You can move
Yes.
between them freely. It's
Yes,
not
it
like
is one
they're
world spatially sharded between servers. So it'll be a much larger world. And the cool thing is the empires and other stuff can like cross these regions. So like you basically are going to have one big world map with all the empires in the whole world, but each kind of sub area of the world will be split up into different regions. So we'll be able to support a lot more players than we could in the last alphas.
if I have an empire, how easy is it to stay out of war? Like, can anyone declare war on me, or am I just stay in my little corner and be peaceful? I guess I can answer that one. You can't prevent it fully, but like you can stay out of people's way, and there's not really an incentive for them to mess with you.
Basically,
Um,
war is expensive and maintenance is cheap. So if you pick an area that nobody else wants to control, then nobody will. It'll be very easy to maintain that for a long time if nobody fights you for it. And if you have another empire that's beside you, you guys can go to war and both spend a ton of resources to try and take a little bit of each other's territory, or you could form an alliance and just say, this isn't like a formal system in the game. It's just a matter of communicating through the game with those other empires and say, listen, we have a shared set of ideals. I don't want your territory. You don't want mine. Let's just have a border here and agree not to attack each other. And hey, maybe if they get attacked, you help them with some supplies or something like that. And then now you have an alliance. So there's definitely ways to play an empire that's very diplomatic and avoiding conflict or mitigating it as much as possible.
Let's see. Will empire owners still get that crown? Will there be an item like that for titles along emperors who aren't the owner too?
This is a system that we're planning to expand. I think basically having unlockable cosmetics for not just the emperor is 100% something we're doing. So we're adding the concept of empire capes, which will extend all the way down to citizens. You might have seen that in the trailer. And the empire will be able to customize these capes to like give their empire an emblem and like a flag, which is really cool. We want to expand this even more in the future. So having like robes or some other clothes that mid-ranking empire members can have, and how those get unlocked, I think is an interesting system to add in the future.
Is it possible to create and maintain empires without and hexite capsules without paying real world money? The answer right now is no. Somebody has to do that,
But it doesn't need to
but
be you.
it doesn't need to be you, and also it doesn't need to be a lot, depending on where you are. Obviously, if you're
Yep,
fighting over the center of the map or something,
exactly.
might be.
So I can give an example of like what that might look like. So if you wanted to start a small empire, or maybe a large one, depending on how much conflict you have, um, you can obtain hexite shards just by trading with other players. Or sorry, hexite capsules by trading with other players. And so what does that mean? You basically need hexite capsules to maintain and expand your empire, but you can just basically, you can say you have a whole bunch of logs and there's some empire that needs logs. You can just go trade them and say like, hey, we want to buy some hexite capsules. Here's a bunch of logs. You take those hexite capsules, you go to a new area and you start your own empire. So the thing is, those hexite capsules contain hexite that somebody paid for. It just might not have been you.
How do you, Octave asks, how do you deal with influencers, I suppose, or content creators swarming areas, influencing a player count instead of actual game mechanics? I think the point of the Empire system is that social dynamics are absolutely part of the game mechanics. That's what an empire is. It's convincing a lot of people to join you under the same banner if you want to have a big one. So I would say basically where we would encourage people to try and get as many people to join their empire as possible,
Yeah.
um,
And I mean,
rather than discourage it.
part of the design principle behind the three scales of the game, which I would go read the blog we have on scales if you haven't, if you're not familiar with that, but basically is player like gameplay should be able to exist at these three scales simultaneously without having a huge impact on each other in terms of like disrupting them. So if there's a whole bunch of characters running around the world that are kind of focused on like their streamer's empire that they're like doing logistics for, or they're helping in some way, the players who are like building their settlement or gathering and crafting and exploring as a character themselves, if you're focused on these other scales, a bunch of other people focused on the empire scale should basically be having no disruption on you. I mean, they might be like visible in your world space or chatting in the area chat, but you can mute these things um if that's like becomes too much of an issue. But otherwise, like them doing their empire stuff and you know, cutting down trees and crafting stuff should be able to happen, you know, coexist basically.
Marcato's sound has been chatting about the Empire system. I've been just taking a look at
Yeah.
that. You can avoid the Empire system. That's totally fine. You can also just help some other empire if you want to play in the system, but you don't want to pay, right? So you can just say, hey, I like these people. They seem to be going. They will need more help than just money. That's like not, it's, I wouldn't even say the majority of it. So if you just want to enjoy it, join an empire. Um, just if you want to wear the crown, you may need to pay. That's the only that's the
or
only thing.
or you need a bunch of other benefactors.
Or you need
uh
a bunch of other factors.
um
And I get it. Like the thing is, obviously we need to set up the game in some way where we can pay for the development of it. And I just think it's kind of an interesting way to do it. To sort of say like, hey, look, if you want to be a baller and roll around with your crown and stuff, um, it's sort of an interesting way to do that gameplay and not have and make it so that you can play in that system without you actually having to be the person that pays.
yeah, i think I think there's people out there who like the idea of being able to spend money and have status in a game. And I think especially there's a lot of games that offer you the ability to be the king of a bunch of NPCs and you're kind of rivaling against other kings. But I think BitCraft might be one of the few games out there where you would be able to become the king of what is conceptually other players, although we're trying to find the right balance to make sure that like those other players are not beholden to you, but you still get to be the king of actual territory in a world that other people are using. And I think that's a much more compelling skin than just being, the king of a bunch of, virtual armies that you basically just get like generated in some strategy game.
Yeah, and Marcado Sound has further thoughts, which is we're from a big YouTube channel and we were seriously considering a big empire for our channel, but we aren't really in the business of sinking money into maintaining something like that. Totally makes sense. That's why I'm asking these questions. We're still excited for the game, just disappointed the empire system isn't going to be something worth engaging with. I think that's why we have the settlement for you, right? So it's you could have a very big city state or a capital city in the middle of the world where everybody goes to trade. That's really what that scale of the game is designed for you. Like you have
Yep.
the solo part of the game for people who want to play by themselves. We have that part of the game for channels who want to come in and make themselves very well known and very important in the game. And then we have the empire system for people who want to just um, make their name on the map.
Yeah.
So
And I think what we've
ideally,
seen in the past alphas is that a lot of times these different player archetypes end up teaming up because you'll have some player that wants to be the emperor, but they are not interested in doing all the kind of complicated stuff needed to like build a good capital city. And so what they might do is like you might have someone who comes to you and says like, "Hey, listen, you guys have built such a great city. I want to start an empire. Can I make this empire can I make this city my capital for my empire? And I will, bankroll the city basically."
so
Um,
actually, here's a question for you, Marcado. Um, if you guys were a big city, right, would you consider joining an empire as like a sort of a vassal of that empire to help them or do whatever you want? And you get benefits obviously from them because they're going to want to essentially bribe you into joining the empire. That's kind of that might be up to your boss. Um, that's kind of the where that could come into it.
Cool. Settlement scale, I can go really quickly on this one. I think there's probably going to be less questions here. This is at least the section where we have less immediate plans, but I do still think there's a few things I want to mention that we covered in the blog. Basically, right now there's not really a way for settlements to compete with each other. The biggest do conflict with each other. The extent that we have right now is just like friendly competition through kind of trying to offer a better deal, basically. So there's a very strong symbiotic relationship between characters and settlements. That being, settlements provide stuff characters need, and when characters get that value from settlements, the settlements earn income, not paid by the players. It's just generated. And so if there's two settlements and there's a fixed number of players, both settlements are going to want to offer like better stuff so that the players come to their settlement and then they earn more income. And so, this can turn into like a form of competition, but there isn't a direct way for one settlement to like attack or, try and get another settlement to like move away or something like that. Um, and I think we're trying to find the right balance of like, to what degree should there be, basically, like if there's another settlement right on your doorstep and you want to expand, should there be a way for you to be able to like nudge them more strongly to leave, other than just like taking their income by attracting all the players? So yeah, you can start a trade war. You can kind of try to attract all their citizens, but there isn't a more outright conflict. And so that's kind of basically we're just going to keep tabs on this. It's not planned to come immediately into the game, but I think it might be needed longer term to have the game be able to kind of maintain itself, and have a good steady state. Cool. Just to cover a few final things before we
Sure.
run out of time here. So we talked about the Empire and the settlement scale conflict. We obviously talked about PvE combat. So I wanted to circle back around on the character scale and talk a little bit about this, which is kind of the last part before the blog wraps up, which is kind of two forms of conflict or combat or competition at the character scale. One is basically just noting the fact that the character scale explicitly, we are trying to do the opposite of promoting competition and conflict. So originally in early versions of Bitcraft, there was this heavy emphasis on like you were gathering something or you were crafting something, and if someone else was coming to gather it, they were taking something away from you. Like they were taking the resources when you were trying to gather them. And so we really wanted to make sure, basically we found that this just meant that like every player just wanted to go away from other players, and it completely destroyed the social kind of intent behind the game. And so what I would say is like a core philosophy around the character scale, especially like exploration, gathering, crafting, is that being around other players should always be at the worst neutral, but ideally it's beneficial. And so, going around in a group to gather together should be rewarding as opposed to going out by yourself. And we've already kind of done this in the example I've given with fishing here, but we want to expand that to other gathering and crafting professions. I think having all the players be able to benefit from the shared crafting stations in the settlements was another big step in this direction. Um, and then finally, adding the aggressive monsters to the wilderness also further encourages like exploration and gathering together, because you can fight off monsters if you get attacked, by having a small party with you. Um, and so definitely as far as the like exploration, gathering, crafting, we want to make sure that the game is really encouraging cooperation. Um, the asterisk to this is I think a lot of people have asked about PvP combat. And so while there is currently no like direct PvP combat in BitCraft right now, we wanted to talk about like what are our thoughts on it and what does the future of this potentially look like. And so the short version of this is that, like I said, there's no PvP combat right now. However, it's something that as we've improved the gameplay mechanics of combat for the PvE stuff, it's something that we've been basically looking at, um, the possibility of adding. I think it's not something that we've been principally against. We just want to make sure that the role that PvP combat has in Bitcraft aligns with the vision for the game, which is that, by and large, Bitcraft is about rebuilding civilization with a bunch of other people. And so the core like character and settlement loop should be generally speaking cooperative, although there can be room for competition. And the empire scale is kind of the political aspirations getting in the way of this like rebuilding civilization together. And so it creates like this interesting kind of counterforce. And so where does it make sense to have PvP combat in the game? Well, what we've done right now to just kind of dip our toe in the water is we've added the ability to duel. And so I think this is a really friendly way to add basically zero stakes PvP combat that allows players to practice combat for PvE. And it allows us to just see like how do players engage with this, and like do players organize tournaments to do like some gladiator style thing. Could be really interesting to see. And then if players are engaging and enjoying PvP combat as a mechanic, I think we're going to be looking at what are some ways that have the right level of risk reward, and kind of making sure that it's opt in for us to explore PvP combat in other aspects of the game. And I think the main place we're looking at this as the first vertical would be introducing limited PvP combat around Empire sieges. And so I mentioned that there's some modified death mechanics that we've changed since the last alpha. And so having ways to introduce kind of like protection and attacking to Empire sieges for the logistics supplies that you're bringing there, I think will be really interesting. So instead of just having two teams funneling their supplies into the cannon and the tower 10 feet away from each other, you're going to be bringing in mercenaries or guards to like guard your logistics people. And if you see they have, hexite capsules that are undefended, you can just run over and KO them and take those hexite capsules and use it for your attack. Obviously, this is going to need some careful thought into the balancing. We don't want Empire sieges to just devolve into who has the best army. We want the supplies to still play a role. But we think having, skill and kind of combat and organization of that, those players, could also bring a lot more strategy and intrigue to the sieges as well. So we're going to be looking to find the right balance there.
We'll not have that. Is PvP going to be skill based or more on equipment?
It's a good question. I think right now, combat, I would say it's not purely skill based. So, like, your equipment does have progression. I think there's an open question of whether the existing, like, PvE gear should carry over 100% to PvP. Like, if we added a PvP aspect to the game, do we want that to be heavily influenced by your gear power, or do we want it to be like a completely fair level playing field with like skill based only? I think probably, at least right now for the dueling, it is using your PvE gear. So it is there is a certain aspect of power coming from the gear, although the general like content design in Bitcraft is that it's not like, level 1 gear and level 5 gear. Like level 5 gear is like 50 times better. It's
But
like 30% better.
clarification though, on that. What do you mean by skill? Do you mean like
Player skill, they mean.
is it player skill or character skill? Does that make sense? I don't know what they were asking. They just said skill, but they could have been thinking like, oh, do I have levels or is it more equipment?
Yeah.
Or it could have been, am I good at the game, or not? Either way, I do think it's important that your progression in the game matters. So I guess yeah, Carter's gonna. I mean, they asked both. So Carter,
Yeah.
how much does I am good at the game versus my character is highly skilled
Yeah.
matter?
So I'll talk about how the game works right now, and then I'll comment on just like how we imagine for stuff going forward. Right now, the way PvE combat works, which is the only kind of gear in combat that we have, other than dueling, is we have a monster slaying skill. You can do a bunch of things, mostly centered around slaying monsters, to level that up. Reaching higher levels in that skill will allow access to certain things, such as like learning new weapon types, like so learning kind of the skills to use different weapon types and whatnot. Um, Gear also has power, so like you can have like tier 1 armor, tier 10 armor, and anything in between, and those have better stats. The stats of the tier 10 armor I think is something like double tier 1, so it's or something in that range. It's not like 100 times better like some other MMOs. So um
And clarification: is the gear gated on your Slayer skill? Like, can you wear the gear?
this is something we've basically, the right now the higher tiers are gated on any level, I believe, which is how it was for the last several alphas. And the but certain, like if you want to use a more exotic weapon type, that is requires you to level up your Slayer skill, I believe. But
Makes
we're kind of, this is something that's not super final. We've been playing with different ways of like how you improve in the power level of the stuff. We've had it where it's like, hey, unlocking the ability, you need to level up your Slayer skill to unlock the schematics for it, but then you can just craft it and anybody can use it. So we're kind of we're playing with, I guess, like what's the right way for that to unlock. I think trying to find the right, basically, as Tyler said earlier, like the thing that's important to us is if your friend comes into the game and you've been playing, say you're level 100 monster slayer and they're level 1, we want to make sure that there's a way for you guys to just jump into the game and do content together. But we also don't want to completely undermine any progression for it as well. So finding the right what's the right way to unlock stuff. I think the kind of more horizontal scaling approach is the direction we've been going recently, of like, hey, maybe your friend can come in, but all they can use is like a simple short sword. Even they can get a very good quality one or a good level one or a high tier one, and but it's not a very interesting depth of combat. And so to unlock different like combat styles, they need to progress. So they have like a very limited role that they can do in combat without progressing, if that makes sense.
So how is PvP going to be determined if players are the same level in the character skills and equipment? Basically,
If
will
they're
it be
if they're equally statted, you mean, basically?
yeah, yep,
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to have combat not just be like, hey, you look at the two skills and you determine who wins the sorry, you look at the
that check.
two stats and you determine who wins. The goal is that there should be a form of skill expression. I would say in terms of the gameplay of BitCraft's combat, our aspiration has always been to make the combat more strategic and less reaction based. So it's more of like, oh, I see this person is like building up, they're like using a bunch of buffs that they're probably leading up to, they're going to do this like, really powerful attack. So I'm going to like preemptively apply some like defensive buffs to like mitigate that or to kind of ruin their momentum into this direction. And so we want it to be like the pace is a little bit slower and more strategic about what types of actions you're taking, rather than just like, oh, they're channeling a 1 second fireball and I'm going to like interrupt their cast, or I'm going to quickly react and like use my shield. It's more seeing kind
So
of the pattern of what they're
to
doing.
summarize, it's not just a stat check. You have to be good at the game. It's like
Yes,
in League of Legends. Somebody mentioned League earlier. Like stats
yes,
matter, but it's not just a stat check. You can be down 3,000 gold and kill somebody. It's
for
maybe not
sure.
the easiest
I think that's a
thing.
great example. I mean, that's what we're going for. I think I can't speak to if we're perfectly doing that right now. I think the the combat and the stats and the content behind that is obviously been reworked very recently. So we're going to need people play testing this to help us hone in on our goal, but that is definitely the goal.
Yeah, the thing is, it's always trickier when you go to multi-person PvP. Like dueling is whatever because you can balance it for two people, but there's always the Zerg problem. And I mean that's like if it's a 4-on-1 in League of Legends, you're probably not winning that either, even if they have less
Yep.
fewer stats or fewer gold per person,
And this goes
less
for
gold.
open world PvE as well, right? I think that's been the biggest challenge of like designing encounters. I mean, we had the Umbura, which was this like mini boss monster that we added in Alpha 3, and we thought it was going to be like impossibly difficult. And when we added it, we had like 50 people show up at the same location and teamed up and killed it together because we just never imagined, we imagined people would be fighting it like 3 to 7 people max. And so if you just put 50 people together, it was trivial. So
See, personally, I think the Zerg problem is not necessarily. I mean, you have to warp your mind to get it to balance, but um, it's not even necessarily a problem. Some things just take an army,
no,
you
no, I
know?
know. So, and I think that's kind of what we learned from that is that like this is not going to be something that we're ever like we're not BitCraft is not an instanced game. Most of the game is taking place in a shared world, and so if that's the nature of PVE combat, that people can just like mass players to do this, um, then I think it's really important that we're thinking about that in terms of like the rewards and how this works. Of like, hey, if you have all these people killing this together, maybe the XP should be split amongst the people, for example, or based on the damage you dealt. And that way, it's like having a million people do this together makes it so that it's not you're not like cheesing the game or the progression of the game. It's kind of designed with that in mind. And so, having two people fight this more challenging things by yourself is going to yield much better XP than having everyone team up and do it. Although teaming up and doing it might get you it's not like there's items for everyone who kills it. It's just one set of items per enemy killed. So just making sure we're balancing correctly around that
Yeah.
assumption is important.
And to address this question because it came up, empires are cosmetic, and PvP will always be optional. It's always opt-in. So
Yes.
that's just a foundational principle of what we're doing.
Yes, exactly.
Is there an end? A little. I don't forget if there's
Yeah,
a
there's one more
conclusion.
section on griefing. So we covered one example here, but I think the most important thing is our principle, which is that we spent a lot of time, Tyler and I, thinking about this when we were very early in the development of BitCraft. And basically it was this question of like, in a game where you can edit the world and modify the terrain and add stuff and remove stuff, what is building the world and what is griefing someone else's stuff is totally subjective. And I'll give you an example. I think Minecraft is a perfect kind of comparison that also is like this. Is like in Minecraft, deleting a block can be building something and it can be destroying something, and placing a block can be building something and it can be destroying something. And so the challenge here is we can't just make it so like building blocks is easy and destroying blocks is hard, as Minecraft has done. With like things like obsidian, it's like, hey, placing obsidian is easy, but destroying it's hard. So then someone can't destroy my obsidian tower. Well, if they just place obsidian blocks all over my farm, they've also griefed me in the opposite way. So we wanted to have that assumption, just not forget about that in the first place, because you can't just make something easy and something hard and you've fixed griefing in a game where editing the world is part of the game. And so what we've tried to do is implement ways that players can kind of create their own protections against griefing, as well as having the right policies that allow us to kind of moderate griefing and take action where it's causing problems. And so, in general, the settlement claiming system gives you a lot of control over basically saying, this is my part of the world. Nobody else can mess with it unless I give them the ability to mess with it. And as long as I do what's needed to maintain that, basically this is your safe area. So nobody can grief your safe area. That is very important. Um, the challenge with that, as I mentioned, is like balancing maintaining these claims is also part of griefing and anti-griefing. And so if it's too easy to maintain a claim, what's to stop some disruptive player from just claiming a massive area and saying, I'm holding this whole area hostage? So basically the cost of claiming needs to be balanced. Um, as far as editing the world, we talked a little about in the blog about the terraforming, which I think is one of the main ways of editing the world. And basically, what we've done here is we understand that basically people are going to want to modify the world in useful ways, but we've added a system where if players are intentionally destroying like unclaimed areas of the world through terraforming, we've made it so it's very easy to terraform it back to its original state. But ultimately, this is up to the players. And so we've played with the idea of having it like automatically decay, like kind of over time, it would automatically terraform back. But I think so far it hasn't made sense to do this. I think there's consequences that come with this that aren't desirable. So um, right now, the goal is to avoid that if we can. And then obviously claiming if you're doing a massive, interesting terraforming project that you really don't want anyone to mess with, you probably want to claim it. And if you are just terraforming, a useful road between some biomes, like this picture here, the idea is like once you've terraformed this, there isn't really a strong motivation for someone to destroy it. And if there is, theoretically, you can put it back. So um, basically there's no silver bullet to this, so we're just going to need to monitor it. And I think if you've played into the alphas, you'll also know that in cases where modifying the world, you might have two people with competing interests. We're not here to label one of them as a griefer and one of them as not, and nuke their stuff. um when it comes to like terraforming or something like this, when it comes to explicitly inhibiting other players, so for example, we had some cases where players were claiming and like walling in other players, and preventing them from leaving that area. These are cases where this is clearly kind of against the spirit of the game and against our rules, and so we've taken action to basically just remove the infraction there and issue kind of consequences as needed. And I think in most cases it was just destroying the wall and destroying the claim, which is obviously at a severe cost to the person who did it. But in cases where that's not just a friendly joke or something like that, I think if it's a repeated behavior, we're definitely going to take more permanent action. And so I guess that's our current policy on this. If players are explicitly going out of their way to like destroy the experience of others, we're gonna label that as kind of um, actionable griefing or rule breaking, and we're gonna take action on it. In cases where players kind of have different competing goals and they're trying to compete within the systems of the game in a fair way, we're not going to be stepping in there.
I think what
So
you're saying is you can have competing goals. It's just that your goal can't be this person can't have any fun.
yes.
Uh,
So for example, like if players terraformed a road to get legit like empire logistics to their outposts, and then some other players want to go do guerrilla warfare and like go destroy the road in that other empire's territory, we're not here to like
adjudicate.
adjudicate that. If someone is like taking someone's spawn area and they made it so they can't get out of the spawn area or something like that, that's obviously a different story. So
Yes. One thing, Control Z to undo said, I have no interest in PvP. This will gate me from the rewards you're talking about. So I just
what
want to be very clear.
rewards?
Yeah, we don't know precisely the rewards you mean, but in general, that's not the goal. If PvP is going to cut off some of the game from some people, we don't really want to do it. That's why it's opt-in.
Yeah, basically,
This
if
is the
we are
problem.
adding PvP, in the case of dueling, what is the reward for dueling? Nothing. Other than if you create your own rewards around that of like, oh, whoever wins this duel, I'm going to invite or I'm going to promote in the Empire or something like that. You can create your own rewards around that, but there's no game rewards that we're giving based on that. It's only other players. And for the Empire PvP battles, there's also no rewards for the characters. It's basically, you might have an Emperor say, hey, if you help me win this battle, I will trade you some items, but that is another player giving you a reward, not us. So there's no rewards from the game for doing PvP, just so that's clear.
Yes, I will say. So Fenicky asks, "Do people not understand what opt-in PvP is?" And actually, it's kind of a nuanced question, to be honest, because you can say like, "Oh, PvP is opt-in, but you can't get all of this cool stuff at the end of the game." So basically,
Yes.
the end of the game for you is shorter than it would be for other people. That's not what we're doing either. It really should be just for fun, just for we're just having a good time, not like, "Oh, actually, this is how you unlock all of this other part of the game that you are
Yes.
not able to do."
I mean, I think the best way to describe it is like we as the game developers are not going to give any rewards for PvP. The only rewards are the satisfaction of doing the PvP or other rewards that other players generate for PvP. Like if someone wants to reward you for doing some PvP for them or something, or reward you with something for winning a duel, that's up to them. But it's not something that we are incentivizing or putting content that you would desire behind some requirement of PvP.
Actually, the Mighty Zero says it very well. Empires, and I would extend it also to PvP, are a role play thing, guys.
Yes.
And I think that's a good way of putting it. This is a role play type
Yes.
system.
Empires are basically LARP in BitCraft.
Yes, exactly. Just
BitCraft
not like
action
that.
roleplay.
It's just it's just BCRP.
um, yes.
Cool. Shall we wrap it up then around
Yes.
this? Maybe we'll do another stream uh, after that.
Yeah, I mean, we're basically at the end of the blog here. I think that covered all the topics. I think if there's any final questions, we can maybe do a few more minutes of questions and then we have to wrap it up. General PvE question: with the enemies updates, if I progress my skills and gear, can I solo a group of low tier enemies? Is that still a group effort? I think definitely yes. I mean, from my take on the current internal playtesting right now is like definitely if you have high tier gear and you're leveling up your Slayer skill, certainly if you have both of those things, you should be able to make easy work of the low level enemies. If you lose in PvP, do you die? So I assume you're talking about the current dueling in the game, which is the only form of PvP that's in the game right now. When you reach 0 health, you get like knocked down, but it's a less punishing. Basically, it's a no punishment knockout compared to getting KO'd in PvE. So you don't get debuffed in the same way. And I mean, you still have to wait for your health to regen, but you are not. Basically, you're knocked down for a second and then you get back up, and that's the end of the duel. In PvE, if you get knocked down, there's more of a like kind of debuff to your character that lasts a while. And so in a more like Empire versus Empire PvE in the future, it would probably have more of a penalty to it, similar to PvE. But for dueling, there's no penalty. Basically, the monetization blog and then the combat conflict blog that we went over today is just the beginning. So as we approach the Steam Early Access release, we're going to be doing more streams, more blogs, more information. I know people have been asking about, patch notes, what's coming, basically what are all the changes coming from Alpha 3 to the beginning of beta, what's the roadmap for the future. This is stuff that we're working on and we're hoping to share with you guys very soon. Will there be tests before early access or no? There will definitely be at least 1 to 2 tests before early access. We are in the kind of just like coordination stages of like working with Steam, getting the analytics in place, getting our infrastructure in place to run those. But it's basically what I was working on before I came on the stream today. So we are hoping to do those as soon as possible.